Hi guys, Zach Greenwald here with Strength Ratio, and we're introducing part 2 of our sustainable training series. Our primary audience is the weightlifting community, though if you're not in the weightlifting community, there's still some nuggets and pearls for you to pick up as we go. And we're going to be talking about first a recap of a periodized plan and what that looks like, and then we're going to focus the majority of our attention on hypertrophy for weightlifters, talking about the basic first and then specific considerations. What led us to begin the sustainable training series was that we found that people's training on social media and when we go to meets and other different events was hardly sustainable. We see a lot of people, namely weightlifters, because this is our intended audience for this video, alternate back and forth between strength and peak. The weights always seem to be above 85%, and if they're not above 85%, the lifter's peaking for competition. To allow for sustainable training, we've peeled back the layers, and we've already discussed the accumulation phase in our last video, where our specificity is really low because we've just come off the meet. Note that this is the cycle that we're encouraging, not the back and forth between strength and peak, and where volume is much higher. In this hypertrophy phase, we're just coming closer to the specificity of one arm snatch and clean and jerk with subtly less volume, but we're not quite yet there. In fact, these few rep ranges for most of our weightlifters would be new and foreign and deemed CrossFit or I'm dying, Coach Y, because the reps have always been low and it's always gone back and forth between peaking. Not always, but in our observation, the majority of the time. A quick talk about the basic mechanisms of hypertrophy. We have loading, where the weight is greater and the reps are lower. We have metabolic stress, where the opposite is true. The loading is less and the volume is much higher. We'll talk about how that factors in to the specific considerations of programming for a hypertrophy block, but we just want to be aware that you can achieve hypertrophy with two basic mechanisms, and that's with the load for less reps and with lesser load for higher reps. Now there is this bro science type rep range, what is deemed the hypertrophic rep range, that works a good percent of the time, and we'll explain why. The literature, most recent sports science literature, and really literature and diving into muscle physiology, shows us that all of strength training is hypertrophic in nature. When we elicit an adaptation with heavy weight, low load versus low load, high reps, we're going to, as long as we're creating a stress response, have a hypertrophic adaptation. In fact, that's shown to be quite similar with the accumulation type weights and loading relative to the weight and loading in the strength block. So if that's the case, why is there a hypertrophic or hypertrophy type block or range? Well, it's because it's most practical, in our opinions, to have this rep range for these purposes. If we only ever moved low load for high reps, yes, we would gain hypertrophy, but eventually we could only push the volume so high before eventually we can only manipulate the weight so much, because we're never spending time in this absolute strength phase or near absolute strength phase, just outside of it, in the hypertrophy zone. Because this strength endurance or accumulation phase, while it is hypertrophic, will not increase your strength. But if we cycle through, where we work on our endurance, we work on our mid-rep range abilities, we also improve our 1RM abilities, and the next time we come through, our volume is going to be taken off of newer percentages, therefore newer adaptations. So, we're focusing around this rep range here. In the accumulation block, you're training for about a month. You're coming off your meet, maybe you took a week off and ate whatever the heck you wanted to, but then you got into a cycle that was about a month long, training 2 to 4 days a week. At this point of time, you're feeling comfortable, you're into your program, we're upping the frequency 4 to 6 days per week, and you're not just gonna gain muscle mass over time, or overnight. You will certainly gain over time with consistency, and that's exactly what we want. 3 months of hypertrophy type training in this rep range. When I say hypertrophy training, from here on out, you're just going to think this rep range over 3 months while going through this cycle multiple times over multiple years will elicit significant muscle or hypertrophic adaptations. How do we program for it? Very generally, we like to start people off with about 2 sets on average of their given exercise, maybe about 5 reps away, so we can say from failure, and then about 3 reps from failure, and about 2 or 1 reps from failure. So what we're going to make sure is that as the volume increases, so too does the weight, but we're going to make sure that we're prioritizing volume in this block. After 3 weeks of running this style of training, we can then deload here. We have found great success with something that Juggernaut Training Systems encourages, which is about a 90%, or rather a 10% reduction, 90% of the load you used in this overload block for your weight, and about 50 to 70% off of the volume that you used. Then you basically wash and repeat for however long you're running the cycle. As for the specific considerations for a weightlifter, why, besides the fact that it's not sustainable unless you're taking drugs, can you go back and forth, strength to peak, is because we also want to make sure that we have time to practice good technique, and we can also start involving some complexes. In the accumulation block, we have recommended that, hey, keep the weight light, use some technique, and build a lot of volume with the snatch and clean jerk derivatives. Well, now we're getting slightly more specific, so you might have some complexes, which is going to mirror the metabolic stress that we have, while training in this rep range, your major pulls, your deadlifts, and your squats. That's the load. So you're getting both spectrums, or both mechanisms of hypertrophy with the metabolic stress for your snatch and clean jerk complexes, as well as the loading of your snatch and clean jerk derivatives. A really important consideration as well is for weight class considerations. If you're not on the cusp of a weight class and you sometimes dabble back and forth based on what meet it is or how well your dieting is going, then we recommend filling out your weight class. Get as muscular and as strong as you can so that you can eventually peak for one-arm snatches and clean and jerks that'll just keep increasing and increasing as you fill out your weight class more and more. On the flip side of things, if someone's going down, if someone's cutting, let's say they have a month or a meet that's 3 months out and they're trying not to lose excess muscle mass during that cut, if they only trained in the strength block, the metabolic demands would be quite low. 3 sets of 4 to 5 versus 3 to 6 sets of 8 to 15. This will allow them to keep their energy higher with more food. Training only here will not. So if they're cutting, this phase here and all of what we've described will be most sustainable, not just for preserving muscle mass, but for energy overall. So peeling back the layers, we've noticed that strength to peak is what gets weightlifters in trouble. It's a 1RM sport that involves not always training for 1RM. That's why we encourage you all to spend more time in these zones. Though of course we're going to explain the importance and how to train most wisely to strength than to peak. Hypertrophy has 2 primary mechanisms of occurring. And again, hypertrophy quite simply is the enlargement of the muscle through the load or through the amount of reps you have. We're going to make sure that we are not going to say that endurance rep ranges aren't muscle inducing and strength rep ranges aren't muscle inducing. They all are, but perhaps the most practical is this here. We're going to progress volume and prioritize volume over time with a deload before recycling month after month. And of course, we're not saying that strength doesn't occur, but the strength training will be our next video. But month after month within reason for your meet. We want to have complexes to practice technique and elicit a metabolic stress. We have our snatch derivatives. If you haven't done 2 to 4 sets of snatch and clean deadlifts or 2 to 4 sets of high bar squats, then you're in for a rude awakening. It's brutal, but it's going to make you a better weightlifter. And we have these weight class considerations down here that I spoke of. The last point is that muscle mass does have its carryover to strength. With a greater cross-sectional area of muscle, we will ultimately produce most force or more force. There are a lot of neurological components that go into increasing one's 1 rep maximal abilities, but there definitely is a carryover of the increased muscle mass from this training block and others prior. So stay tuned for more on the strength series, specifically the strength video coming out next week. Comment below, let us know what you think, and share with your friends. Thanks, guys.